3 men in tactical uniforms were chaining a ranch gate shut when the landowner gave one warning. "Get off my land," he said. The HOA president stepped from a white SUV, smiled, and claimed her patrol now controlled every road and gate in the valley. He asked for badges. She showed plastic cards. He asked for a court order. She laughed. Then one man grabbed his shoulder and reached for his radio, and the landowner recognized the patch, a design he had personally helped build for a real federal protocol. Rebecca Sterling had just turned petty harassment into a felony. It was 6 a.m. when Mason Roark drove his old pickup truck down the eastern road of Silver Ridge Ranch. Fog still clung low across the grass, thick enough to blur the horizon, and for a moment the world looked exactly the way it had when his father was still alive to see it. From a distance he noticed flashing lights, blue and white, cutting through the mist near his own front gate. A black SUV sat parked sideways, blocking the entrance completely. 3 men in tactical gear were wrapping a heavy new chain around the post, working with the calm efficiency of men who believed they had every right to be there. Across their backs, stitched in bold white letters, were the words Silver Ridge Patrol. Mason stopped his truck about 20 feet away and simply watched for a long moment before doing anything else. He did not shout. He did not immediately reach for his phone. He studied them instead the way he had studied hundreds of uniformed men over the course of a career most people in this valley knew nothing about. Body armor. Radios clipped at the shoulder. Tactical belts loaded with equipment that had no business on a residential road. One man wore a metal name badge, shaped like a star, polished until it caught the early light, and Mason understood immediately what he was looking at. These men were not simply wearing uniforms for visibility. They were dressing to be mistaken for something they were not. He stepped out of the truck and asked the obvious question, the one any landowner would ask. "Who gave you permission to touch my gate?" The man in charge turned around slowly, unbothered, and instead of answering, demanded to see identification of his own, as if the badge on his chest somehow outranked the deeds sitting in a filing cabinet 3 miles away. Mason looked at him for several seconds before responding. "You are standing on my land," he said, "and you are asking me for my papers." The man introduced himself only through his tone, calling this a community enforcement operation, a phrase that meant absolutely nothing under any law Mason had ever studied. The man who had grabbed at his radio introduced himself almost proudly as the field commander of the patrol, a title that existed nowhere in any incorporation document, any county contract, or any legal filing Mason would later find. His name, Mason would soon learn, was Travis Boone, and the confidence in his voice suggested he had said that title out loud many times before, always, to people too intimidated to question it. Mason noted the way the other 2 men positioned themselves, one near the front bumper of his truck, one near the rear, a formation designed less for safety and more for control. It was the kind of positioning taught in real law enforcement academies, and seeing it performed by men with expired licenses made something cold settle in Mason's chest. Mason told them to leave. That was warning number 1. The man refused, planting his boots wider, clearly enjoying the resistance. Mason repeated himself calmer the second time, which unsettled the man more than shouting would have. That was when a second vehicle arrived, a white SUV moving fast down the gravel, and a woman stepped out wearing a tailored blazer that looked far too expensive for a dirt road at dawn. She smiled the way people smile when they believe they have already won. Her name was Rebecca Sterling, and she announced without a trace of hesitation that the Homeowners Association had expanded its security jurisdiction to cover the entire eastern corridor of the valley. Mason asked which government body had granted that jurisdiction. Rebecca answered simply that her board had. Mason nearly laughed out loud, but he held it back because something told him this woman was not joking, not even a little. She gestured toward her man to continue locking the gate, and Mason issued his final warning, quiet, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. "Rebecca," he said, "get your people off my land." She looked him straight in the eye and asked almost playfully, "Or what?" That was when the man in charge stepped forward and placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, reaching for his radio, as if to call for backup against an unarmed rancher standing on his own property. Mason looked down at the hand on his shoulder and then up at the patch stitched onto the man's chest, and something in his expression shifted completely. The eagle emblem, the lettering, the spacing of the badge number. It was an unmistakable, almost exact copy of an interagency security identification design, one Mason had personally helped evaluate decades earlier during his years working compliance investigations for federal contractors. He asked very softly who designed this patch. The man only smirked. Rebecca answered, instead proud, certain of herself, telling him her attorney had confirmed the whole operation was completely legal. Mason nodded, once turned back toward his truck, and Rebecca assumed wrongly that she had just watched a man surrender. Before he closed the door, Mason spoke one more time, and his voice carried none of the anger she expected. "Don't change the uniforms," he told her. "I want the investigator to see exactly what I just saw." Rebecca laughed loudly, delighted, certain this was an empty threat from a bitter old rancher who had simply run out of arguments. 14 days later, that exact sentence would be played aloud in front of a grand jury, pulled directly from the recording of her own patrol's body cameras. And by then, Rebecca Sterling would understand exactly how badly she had misjudged the man standing at that gate. To understand how it came to this, it helps to go back 6 months earlier, long before chains and badges and flashing lights. Silver Ridge Ranch stretched across 1,840 acres of Wyoming grassland land that had belonged to the Roark family for more than 70 years. Mason's father, Walter Roark, used to say that land did not care who was richer than whom, it only remembered who kept their word. Mason had spent most of his adult life far away from that land, first in Washington and later in Denver, moving between windowless conference rooms and internal investigations most people would never hear about. While he worked, his father grew old alone on the ranch, tending fences and cattle without complaint, never once asking his son to come home sooner. When Walter passed away, Mason found a battered cardboard box tucked into the corner of his father's office, filled with survey maps, deeds, and decades of correspondence about easements and rights of way. Walter had kept everything, every letter, every map, every note scribbled in the margins of old documents, and Mason soon understood exactly why. Just south of the ranch sat Silver Ridge Estates, a gated community of 312 luxury homes governed by a homeowners association under the leadership of Rebecca Sterling. Over 3 years, property values in that development had climbed sharply, driven by clever marketing and an image of exclusivity that Rebecca had built with obsessive precision. There was, however, one persistent problem with Silver Ridge Estates. Only a single main road connected the development to the highway, and during Wyoming winters, that road frequently closed under heavy snow, cutting residents off for days at a time. There was another route, an older service road that cut directly through Mason's property, known locally as the Roark East Service Road. If the homeowners association could secure legal access to that road, the value of every home in Silver Ridge Estates would rise dramatically, potentially by tens of millions of dollars combined. Rebecca had offered to purchase an easement once already, and Mason had refused without hesitation. She raised the offer. He refused again. It was never about the money, not for Mason. Years earlier, his father had made him promise to keep that road private because at the far end of it sat a stretch of native grassland Walter had spent 40 years painstakingly restoring by hand. Rebecca never understood any of that, and truthfully, she never tried to. To her, land was simply an asset waiting to be leveraged, a line item that had not yet been properly monetized. She had built her career in real estate marketing long before taking over the association, and she approached every negotiation the same way she once approached, selling a house with staged smiles, curated language, and a practiced refusal to hear the word no as anything final. To Rebecca, refusal was simply a stage in the process, a temporary obstacle to be managed with enough patience, enough pressure, or enough money placed on the table. 3 months after Mason's second refusal, official letters began arriving from the homeowners association, citing landscaping violations, fencing violations, signage violations, an endless stream of minor accusations against a man who was not even a member of that association. Mason read every single letter carefully before placing it into a growing folder labeled simply, Attempted HOA Claims. When his family's longtime attorney Eleanor Graves first reviewed that folder, she pointed out the obvious flaw in Rebecca's strategy. "You are not even part of that association," she said. Mason agreed completely. "Then why keep the letters at all?" Eleanor asked. Mason looked at the growing stack for a long moment before answering. "Because whoever sent them knows that too," he said quietly, and that single sentence would prove to be the first real clue that Rebecca Sterling was not simply harassing a difficult neighbor out of frustration. She was manufacturing a paper trail. Every letter, every violation notice, every polite but pointed piece of correspondence was designed to build a false historical record, one she could later use to argue that the homeowners association had exercised long-standing authority over Mason's land. It was a slow, patient, almost bureaucratic form of theft, built letter by letter, month by month, until one day the fiction might simply be mistaken for fact. Mason recognized the pattern almost immediately because he had spent decades studying exactly this kind of quiet, methodical manipulation in his professional life, long before Rebecca Sterling ever knew his name. He began photographing each letter as it arrived, along with the postmark and the exact date it was placed in his mailbox, creating a second independent record, entirely separate from the one Rebecca believed she was building. It was a strange kind of chess match, one where only one player understood that a game was even being played. The Silver Ridge Community Patrol first appeared publicly at the beginning of October, arriving with only 2 SUVs before quickly expanding to 4. Flashing amber lights, body cameras clipped to chest straps, radios crackling with practiced authority, black tactical uniforms that mirrored almost too closely the look of actual law enforcement. Rebecca sent an email to every resident announcing that her new patrol had the authority to stop vehicles, record license plates, perform what she called temporary detentions, and protect something she referred to as community access corridors. That last phrase caught Mason's attention immediately because he had never heard anyone use it before, and he suspected she had invented it specifically to describe his own road. He drove to the county records office and searched through every relevant file he could find. There was no new easement on record, no court order granting access, no agreement of any kind with the county sheriff's department authorizing a private patrol force. The entire operation belonged to a newly formed limited liability company called Sterling Civic Protection with Travis Boone, listed as its operating manager. Mason quickly discovered that Travis had previously worked for 3 different security companies, had been dismissed from 2 of them, and was currently operating with an expired private security license. More troubling still, Travis had once received a formal warning for falsely representing himself as a special officer during a routine vehicle stop. Mason called Eleanor with his findings. Rebecca did not hire the wrong man by accident, he told her. What do you mean? She asked. She hired exactly the kind of man she needed, he said, someone who genuinely enjoyed playing the role of law enforcement without any of the accountability that came with it. Mason began installing additional cameras around the property, some visible and obvious, others deliberately hidden along quiet fence lines and tree cover. Eleanor asked why he bothered hiding half of them. Cameras people can see change how they behave. Mason explained, but cameras they never notice capture who they really are underneath the performance. 3 days later, a patrol SUV crossed onto Mason's land for the first time. He did not stop them. He simply recorded the time, the license plate, and the exact GPS coordinates where they entered. The next day, they returned. The day after that, Travis stepped out and began photographing the front gate. On the 4th visit, he measured the width of the road with a tape measure, and on the 5th, he planted an orange survey stake directly into the ground beside the driveway. Mason pulled the stake out with his bare hands, sealed it inside an evidence bag, and carefully logged the date and time. Rebecca believed his silence meant surrender. In reality, he was quietly assembling a timeline that would eventually bury her. Mason also began keeping a simple written log beside his kitchen door, a plain notebook where he recorded the make, model, and color of every patrol vehicle, along with the names of the officers when they were visible on badges or introduced themselves in conversation. He labeled the notebook nothing more dramatic than visitor log, and it sat in plain view on the counter, never hidden, because he understood that people who believed they were being watched openly often behaved very differently from people who believed they were operating in secret. By the 12th documented trespass, Mason already had more than enough evidence to support a civil claim, but Rebecca was about to hand him something far more dangerous, something that carried the weight of criminal intent rather than simple property disputes. Around this same time, Eleanor asked a question Mason had been avoiding for weeks. Why did he understand how quickly these people built a false image of authority she wanted to know, and why had he recognized the pattern so instantly at the gate that morning? Mason went quiet for a long time before finally answering her honestly. 24 years earlier, Mason had not chased criminals through city streets or worked undercover in dangerous operations. His job had been far less dramatic, though no less important. He spent decades as a security compliance investigator evaluating private organizations that crossed the invisible line between legitimate security work and outright impersonation of law enforcement. He worked on small regional airports, energy facilities, federal contracting sites, and industrial complexes scattered across the country. In one particularly serious case, a private security company had designed uniform patches nearly identical to a government agency's official insignia, and the consequences had been severe. Residents in that case genuinely believed they were legally required to comply with these private guards. Employees started demanding identification from ordinary citizens. Then they began detaining people. Then they began searching vehicles without any legal authority whatsoever. Mason learned a hard truth during those years, one that never left him. False authority almost always begins with a uniform, and it grows stronger through the silence of people who feel too intimidated to question it. Over the course of his career, Mason testified in 19 separate interagency investigations and helped develop procedures specifically designed to identify exactly this kind of impersonation before it could spiral out of control. That was precisely why the moment he saw Travis Boone's patch at the gate, Mason understood immediately how it had been created and why it looked so unsettlingly familiar. Rebecca had copied the design too closely, not identical, but close enough to deceive anyone without specialized training. Mason opened an old safe in his study and pulled out a worn folder of documents, an identification guide, where his own name still appeared listed among the technical consultants who had helped author it. Eleanor read through the pages carefully, then looked up at him with something close to disbelief. "Does Rebecca know what you used to do?" she asked. "No," Mason said. Does Travis know no? He said again. Then they truly picked the wrong man, Eleanor said quietly, setting the folder down on the desk between them. Mason did not smile. Instead, he looked over at an old photograph of his father sitting on the corner of his desk. Walter had never approved of his son's career, not because the work lacked meaning, but because it had kept Mason away from home for far too many years. The very last phone call between father and son had lasted only 4 minutes. Mason had promised he would visit next month. Walter had simply replied that there was always a next month with him, and 8 days later he was gone. That single memory was the reason Mason refused to leave Silver Ridge, now no matter how much money Rebecca offered him. Protecting this land was no longer just about property lines. It was the last promise he still had any chance of keeping. There was a period not long after he had left federal work when Mason genuinely believed he was finished with all of it, finished with badges and jurisdiction and the slow bureaucratic language of authority. He had come home to raise cattle, mend fences, and live quietly the way his father once had. He never expected that the exact skill set he had tried to leave behind in Washington would become the only thing standing between his family's land, and a woman convinced that confidence alone could rewrite the boundaries of what belonged to whom. The person Rebecca had tried to intimidate with fake authority had once spent his entire career investigating exactly that kind of fraud from the inside, and she had no idea how thoroughly this fact would eventually destroy her. One afternoon, Mason was driving along the East Service Road when a patrol SUV appeared behind him, lights flashing insistently in his rearview mirror. He did not stop immediately. Instead, he drove calmly toward a stretch of road covered by 3 of his hidden cameras before finally pulling over. Travis stepped out and ordered him to remain inside the vehicle. Mason opened his door anyway. "Stay in the vehicle," Travis shouted, his voice rising with false authority. Mason asked calmly whether he was under arrest. Travis answered that he was being temporarily detained, exactly the response Mason had been waiting to hear. Based on what authority Mason asked, and Travis pointed toward his badge, calling it Community Enforcement Authority, a phrase with no legal meaning whatsoever. Mason asked again, more precisely this time, which government agency had granted him the power to detain anyone. Travis said nothing. Then Rebecca's voice crackled through his radio, clear and unmistakable, instructing him directly. "Hold him until he complies," she said. Mason heard every word, and so did his own hidden cameras. Travis demanded to see identification. Mason refused. 2 more patrol members positioned themselves on either side of his truck, and for 17 full minutes they refused to let him leave. Mason never raised his voice and never resisted physically. He simply asked short, precise questions. "What is your full name? What company do you work for? What agency granted your authority? Who gave the order to detain me?" Travis answered nearly all of it, convinced he was demonstrating power over a defiant landowner. In reality, he was walking through what amounted to an unofficial deposition, handing Mason exactly the testimony he needed. After 17 minutes, Travis finally let him go. Mason drove straight home and immediately backed up the footage in 3 separate locations. Eleanor arrived that evening, watched the recording twice, and sat in silence for nearly a full minute afterward. "This is no longer an easement dispute," she finally said. "I know," Mason answered. "They held you against your will." "I know," he repeated. Mason pointed toward the radio audio, replaying Rebecca's exact command one more time. "Hold him until he complies." Travis, he told Eleanor, was never the real problem here. Rebecca had given that order herself, directly on the record. Mason later discovered that the patrol's body cameras automatically uploaded footage to a cloud storage server. If the data could be legally preserved before it disappeared, the entire operational history of the patrol would become accessible, not just what happened to him, but every single encounter with every resident they had ever stopped, questioned, or detained. Word of the 17-minute detention traveled quickly through Silver Ridge Estates, whispered between neighbors during morning walks, and repeated over backyard fences with growing unease. A few residents who had experienced their own uncomfortable encounters with the patrol began quietly reaching out to Mason, directly sharing stories they had been too nervous to report on their own. One elderly woman described being followed to her own driveway and questioned about a delivery van parked outside her house for 20 minutes. A young father described being asked to produce identification simply for walking his dog along a public sidewalk near the entrance gate. None of them had filed complaints, because none of them believed anyone would take their word over an official-looking uniform. Mason began writing down every account, careful to note names, dates, and details exactly as they were shared with him. Not long afterward, Rebecca called an emergency homeowners association meeting, and Mason decided to attend in person. The room fell completely silent the moment he walked through the door, since word of the confrontation had already spread through the neighborhood. Rebecca sat confidently at the front of the room with Travis and 2 other patrol officers standing behind her like a personal guard. She announced to the crowd that Mason was obstructing community safety, then projected a map onto the screen behind her, showing the East Service Road highlighted in bright blue labeled clearly as an emergency community access route. Mason stared at the map. He had never seen this document before in his life. Rebecca claimed the road had been recognized by the association for years, recognized by whom Mason asked calmly. The board, she answered. Does your board have the authority to create an easement across someone else's private property? He pressed. Rebecca sidestepped the question entirely and pivoted instead to personal attacks, calling Mason anti-community, bitter, and selfish. He sat quietly through all of it without reacting. Then he asked one simple question that changed the entire trajectory of the meeting. Does the patrol operate under your direct instruction? He asked. Rebecca smiled and answered without hesitation. Absolutely, she said. Eleanor, sitting near the back of the room, lowered her head slightly, recognizing exactly what had just happened. Mason continued. Do you have the authority to order them to detain people? He asked. When community safety requires it, she answered confidently. Travis glanced sideways at her, visibly uneasy for the first time. Mason did not argue further. He simply said thank you and walked out of the room. Rebecca laughed as he left, certain she had won decisively in front of the entire neighborhood. But the meeting had been live-streamed and archived publicly by the association itself, and Rebecca had just confirmed in front of hundreds of witnesses that she personally directed a patrol force that had detained residents without any legal authority to do so. Out in the parking lot, Eleanor caught up with him. Did you plan that? She asked. Mason shook his head. I never put words in Rebecca's mouth, he said. I only gave her a quiet enough room to say them herself. Eleanor moved quickly after that meeting, sending a formal preservation notice, demanding that Sterling Civic Protection retain every piece of relevant evidence, including body camera footage, dispatch logs, radio recordings, patrol reports, training manuals, and personnel records. Rebecca responded immediately, calling the request harassment in an angry email sent to the entire homeowners association. 3 days later, the cloud storage provider's retention policy quietly changed, and Mason received a warning from his attorney that certain files were now at serious risk of automatic deletion. Eleanor filed an emergency motion, and the court granted immediate preservation, freezing every remaining file before it could disappear. What they recovered was staggering. 47 separate videos surfaced from the frozen servers. Mason sat through every single one of them. A man stopped for what the patrol called suspicious driving. A woman ordered to open her trunk for inspection. A homeowner forced to stand outside his own front door for 42 minutes while officers questioned him. A contractor whose driver's license was confiscated and never returned that day. No children appeared in any of the footage, but every adult involved had been treated as though the patrol held genuine legal authority over them. The most disturbing discovery, however, was buried inside a spreadsheet labeled non-compliant residents. The list contained names, home addresses, license plate numbers, estimated work schedules, and detailed notes about each resident's daily habits and routines. This was no longer an untrained security team overstepping its bounds out of carelessness. This was a deliberate surveillance operation built to track and pressure the very people it claimed to protect. Mason's own name appeared at the very top of the list. Beside it, someone had written primary land access obstacle. Below that, in smaller text, was a single chilling instruction: pressure until east route released. Eleanor read that line twice before speaking. Pressure, she repeated quietly. That is their word, Mason told her, not mine. Around this time, an investigator named Nathan Pierce entered the case for the first time. Pierce worked for the state and had crossed paths with Mason more than a decade earlier at a security conference. He walked into Eleanor's office and immediately recognized him. Roark, he said, surprised. What are you doing in the middle of an HOA dispute? Mason said simply that he was retired now. Pierce glanced down at the 47 videos spread across the table and replied dryly that retirement clearly disagreed with him. Pierce confirmed that the state had already received numerous complaints about the patrol, but no single victim had ever compiled enough documentation to support a serious case. Mason had timestamps, GPS, coordinates, video footage, official HOA, letters, corporate filings, public statements, and a clear chain of command connecting every action back to Rebecca herself. You built an entire case file, Pierce told him. No, Mason corrected, looking at the frozen image of Rebecca on the screen. She built it. I just never threw anything away. Pierce spent the following week interviewing several of the residents whose names appeared on the spreadsheet, confirming independently what Mason had already suspected. Nearly every person on that list had at some point in the previous year either questioned the patrol's authority, declined to grant the association access to their property, or publicly criticized Rebecca's leadership during a community meeting. The list was never about safety at all. It was a catalog of resistance, carefully maintained and quietly updated, tracking exactly which residents had refused to simply comply. Investigators later traced the surveillance spreadsheet directly to a computer registered under Rebecca Sterling's own name. There was no longer any meaningful distance between Rebecca and the patrol she claimed to merely oversee. She was its architect. Once Rebecca realized Nathan Pierce had joined the investigation, she shifted tactics immediately. The Silver Ridge Community Patrol vanished from the roads overnight. SUVs were pulled from the lot. The patrol's website disappeared entirely. Rebecca sent a carefully worded email to every resident, claiming the Homeowners Association had never operated any kind of law enforcement organization. Mason placed that email directly beside the recording of her own words from the live-streamed meeting. "Absolutely, they operate under my direction," she had said, only weeks earlier in front of hundreds of witnesses. The two statements contradicted each other completely. Travis called Mason repeatedly, but he never answered. Travis sent a text message instead, warning that things needed to be discussed before the situation spiraled out of control. Mason forwarded the message straight to Eleanor without comment. The following day, Travis hired his own separate attorney, and the first real domino fell. He voluntarily surrendered the patrol's training manual, which contained instructions no legitimate security company would ever put in writing. One page instructed officers to use visible authority to gain immediate compliance. Another advised avoiding any debate about legal jurisdiction while on the roadside. A third instructed persistent landowners to be referred directly to President Sterling. Rebecca insisted publicly that she had never seen the document before, but the file's metadata told a different story, showing it had last been edited from her own personal account. The second domino followed quickly. The Homeowners Association's insurance provider opened its own formal investigation. The third domino arrived soon after, when the bank financing the expansion of Silver Ridge Estates demanded a full explanation regarding the East Service Road, since Rebecca had presented it to lenders as a secured secondary access route, despite never holding any easement or legal right to use it. The entire projected value of the expansion had been built on land she did not own and had no legal claim to. The fourth domino came when 3 members of the Homeowners Association board resigned within the same week, and one of them handed over an internal email that sealed Rebecca's fate more than anything else. In it, she had written that once Roark got tired of patrol pressure, he would finally sign. The investigators reading that message sat in complete silence because it confirmed everything Mason had already suspected. The patrol had never been built purely to protect the community. It had been built as a tool to pressure one quiet landowner into surrendering access to his own family's property. Rebecca called Mason 11 times that week. He never answered once. Finally, she drove to Silver Ridge Ranch alone without Travis, without any patrol vehicles trailing behind her. She stood outside the gate and offered him $4 million for the easement. Mason refused. She raised it to $6 million. He refused again. She pushed it to $10 million, and Mason finally asked her directly whether she genuinely believed this was still a negotiation. Rebecca, visibly losing her composure, demanded to know exactly what he wanted. Mason looked past her toward the open grassland stretching beyond the gate. "I told you on the very first day," he said quietly. "Leave my land." Rebecca had assumed all along that Mason was simply positioning himself for a bigger payout. What she never understood was that he was not seeking money at all. He was seeking a permanent court declaration confirming the East Service Road as private property, along with an injunction permanently barring the Homeowners Association from ever claiming authority over it again. Rebecca stood at the gate for a long moment after Mason's final answer, and for the first time since he had met her. She seemed to genuinely struggle for words. She reminded him that she had built an entire community around the promise of that second road that homeowners had purchased their properties, believing the expansion would eventually include safe winter access. Mason answered that none of those promises had ever been his to keep, and none of the risk she had taken on his behalf had ever been requested. If people bought homes based on a road she never owned, he told her quietly, that was a conversation she needed to have with her lenders and her residents, not with him. There was no amount of money left that could buy her way out of what she had built. The first formal hearing arrived soon after. Rebecca walked in flanked by 3 attorneys, radiating the same confidence she had carried since the morning at the gate. Mason had only Eleanor beside him. Rebecca's legal team attempted to frame the entire situation as a simple boundary misunderstanding between neighbors. Eleanor calmly laid out the evidence piece by piece. 47 videos, 12 separate patrol logs, the training manual, the surveillance spreadsheet of residents, the internal email about pressuring him into signing, the live-streamed meeting recording, 17 minutes of unlawful detention captured on hidden cameras, a fabricated map labeling his private road as a public community access route. When it was Mason's turn to speak, Rebecca's attorney tried a different approach, questioning his background directly, perhaps hoping a rancher would grow flustered under pressure. Mason answered plainly that he had spent 24 years evaluating compliance and authority boundaries for interagency security programs. For how long exactly, the attorney pressed. 24 years, Mason repeated. Had he previously evaluated cases of private security impersonation, the attorney asked. Yes, Mason answered simply. How many times, the attorney demanded. Mason looked directly at Rebecca before answering. Enough to recognize the pattern before Mr. Boone finished locking my gate, he said, and Rebecca's face went pale in front of the entire courtroom. Mason calmly explained the difference between lawful private security and outright impersonation of law enforcement. A security guard could observe, report, and control access strictly within property they were legally hired to protect. What Rebecca's patrol had done went far beyond any of that. They had projected the visual authority of public law enforcement, stopped vehicles without cause, demanded identification from private citizens, claimed powers of detention they never legally possessed, surveilled residents systematically, trespassed repeatedly onto private land, and ultimately conducted a coordinated pressure campaign tied directly to a land access dispute. Nathan Pierce did not disclose the full scope of the ongoing criminal investigation that day, but he confirmed publicly that a separate inquiry was actively underway. The judge issued a preliminary injunction that afternoon, barring the Homeowners Association from entering Silver Ridge Ranch, from asserting any claim over the East Service Road, from using the patrol to make contact with Mason in any capacity, and from altering or destroying any further evidence. But the final blow did not come from Mason at all. It came from Travis. Facing serious legal exposure of his own, Travis chose to cooperate fully, and he handed investigators one final audio recording that changed everything. In it, Rebecca's voice was unmistakable. I don't care if Roark thinks they're cops, she had said. That's the point. People obey uniforms. No one in the room spoke for a long moment after the recording ended. Mason simply looked at Rebecca, and for the very first time since the morning at the gate, she had absolutely nothing to say in response. The accusations and formal investigations connected to impersonating legal authority, unlawful detention, criminal trespass, and conspiracy to apply illegal commercial pressure were referred to the appropriate authorities for further action. Rebecca Sterling was removed from her position within the Homeowners Association entirely. Sterling Civic Protection shut down permanently. The remaining board was forced to bring in an independent management company to oversee the community going forward, and the East Service Road was formally and permanently confirmed as Mason Roark's private property beyond any future dispute. Outside the courthouse, Nathan Pierce turned to Mason and remarked that Rebecca and her patrol had truly picked the wrong landowner to challenge. Mason shook his head slightly. No, he said, glancing down at the thick folder of evidence still resting in Eleanor's hands. They picked the wrong paperwork. 3 months later, Silver Ridge had grown quiet again in the way it used to be, long before any of this began. No black SUVs sat parked at the property line. No flashing lights cut through the morning fog. No men in imitation uniforms lingered near the road, pretending to hold authority they never possessed. Mason drove out to the eastern gate one calm afternoon and found the old chain Rebecca's men had once used still hanging where it had been left. He kept it not as a trophy of victory, but hung quietly inside the barn as a plain reminder of everything the past year had cost and taught him. He repaired his father's original wooden gate by hand, rather than replacing it with anything modern. Eleanor visited that same week and asked why he had not simply installed a newer electric gate instead. Mason smiled faintly. My father built this one, he said. It's old, Eleanor pointed out gently. So was he. Mason answered, and the two of them stood together in comfortable silence for a while. Later, while sorting through more of his father's old papers, Mason found a small handwritten note tucked into the bottom of a folder containing only a single sentence. If someone wants your land badly enough to invent a right check what they're planning to sell. Mason laughed quietly to himself, realizing his father had understood people like Rebecca Sterling long before Mason ever returned home. It turned out Walter had rejected an earlier easement offer for that very same road, years before his son ever came back to Wyoming, and he had carefully preserved every map, every letter, and every scrap of correspondence related to it, almost as if he somehow knew this fight was coming one day. Mason had not been the one to start this conflict. He had simply been the one who finally brought it to an end. Standing at the gate that evening, he looked out over the East Service Road, cutting quietly through the open grassland, and he thought not for the first time about how long he had stayed away from this place while his father grew old without him. There had been years he believed were lost forever, conversations he could never have again, apologies that would never be spoken aloud. But there was still one promise left that he could actually keep, and so he closed the gate, latched it firmly, and locked it shut. This time no one stood on the other side demanding that he open it again. Rebecca Sterling believed a uniform alone could manufacture authority. She believed enough letters sent patiently over enough months could eventually manufacture ownership. And she believed enough sustained pressure could finally force one quiet, unassuming landowner to surrender everything he had promised to protect. What she never understood, not once during the entire ordeal, was that Mason Roark had spent 24 years of his professional life studying people exactly like her. People who mistook confidence for jurisdiction. People who genuinely believed that a bad-shaped piece of stamped metal could somehow replace the actual law. He warned them clearly once at the very beginning. They refused to listen and refused to leave. And by the time they finally understood exactly whose land they had walked onto, their own cameras, their own emails, and their own recorded voices had already gathered everything necessary to bring the entire operation down. Fake authority is always loud, demanding attention and obedience from anyone within earshot. Real ownership, more often than not, sits quietly in a locked filing cabinet, patient and unbothered, simply waiting for someone foolish enough to challenge it.